right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cold War 2.0, Rethinking Analogies in US-China Relations. This event is sponsored by the Long US-China Institute at UC Irvine, and I'm so glad to have all of you with me here today for our first webinar of the new academic year. This webinar will be recorded, and there will be a video of the webinar available on the Long Institute's YouTube channel tomorrow. We will send a link out to that video to all registered participants in a follow-up email tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. So the topic of the webinar today is on the question of whether or not it's useful and accurate to think of the United States and China as being involved in a new Cold War. If you've been reading the news lately, this is a phrase that has tended to be thrown around quite a bit. So in June, The Guardian published an article titled, "US versus China, is this the start of new Cold War?" And the Wall Street Journal responded by publishing an article with the title, "Yes, America is in a Cold War with China." So this is a theme that we've really heard a lot about over the past few months. And as a historian myself, I couldn't help but wonder whether this Cold War framework is really a useful and productive one for understanding what's going on with the world today, and particularly with the United States and China. So I thought, who better to ask than a group of experts on the Cold War, and I'm lucky to be joined by three of them today, all of whom have written extensively on the topic and all of whom have written books on various aspects of Cold War history. So each of our presenters will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for a moderated Q&A. If you would like to ask a question at any point during the webinar, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will collect all of the questions and ask them on your behalf. And just to give all of you a heads up, this event will go for approximately 60 to 75 minutes. So speaking first will be Lorenz Lüthi, an associate professor at McGill University with an expertise in the history of international relations. Professor Lüthi is the author of two books. His first book, The Sino-Soviet Split, Cold War in the Communist World, was published by Princeton University Press in 2008. And he has a new book, which was just published this past year by Cambridge, called Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, Europe. So I will turn it over to you now, Lorenz.
Thank you, Emily, for organizing this panel. And thank you for inviting me to be on this panel with three outstanding scholars of China, and welcome everybody in joining us in the digital world. I have just to start with a confession. I'm actually not a trained China specialist. I'm a historian of international relations who has worked on the Cold War, on China, and on a series of other topics. I want to start this panel with some reflections about the historical Cold War and its relationship to China and the supposedly new Cold War and China. Now, first of all, the term Cold War is a Eurocentric term, coined in October 1945 by the British author of Animal Farm fame, George Orwell. So this is a British perspective from the very beginning. And from this British perspective, there was a conflict between the Soviet Union and the Anglo-American powers, and that conflict had arisen over Poland, Romania, Germany, and maybe the Near East, Turkey and Iran at best. The term essentially denotes a state of increased tensions short of military conflict, i.e. short of hot war. A whole range of reasons might be responsible for the general absence of war. For example, the exhaustion from a previous conflict like World War II, or mutual deterrence and so on. Nevertheless, this very Eurocentric term in 1945 and in subsequent years, took root in international relations and in a discourse about international relations, and it eventually was applied in common parlance to the global politics of the whole period, from roughly 1945-47 to roughly 1989-91. Yet, the Cold War was not cold outside of Europe. There were many hot wars. Just think about the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Indochina War, the Vietnam War, several Indian-Pakistani wars, the Sino-Indian border war, and several military conflicts in the Middle East. And I could go on now. Tens of millions of people died in these wars. So this already shows that the term is highly problematic if you want to describe the second half of the 20th century. It is, in fact, a European-American discursive creation designed to define the post-World War II period and mobilize the Western public in support of containment policies. The term was widely used in the United States and Western Europe, but when you look at East European or Soviet documents from the period, it actually pops up very sparsely. It was not really regularly used until the 1960s and 1970s, that's my estimate, and it usually applied only for relations with Western Europe or the United States. So it's a very limited use. And this is also the case when you think about the Cold War and China. Cold War, or Lengjian in Chinese, is not a term that frequently pops up in documents of Maoist China, or even post-Maoist China. This is also related to the fact that communist parties, in general, not only the Chinese party, had their own discourse. And any student start exploring Cold War history of the socialist world, China included, needs to learn a new terminology. This, by the way, applies not only to the Cold War, but it applies to other concepts. And one, for example, that is often used by Cold War historians is the so-called Sino-Soviet American triangle that supposedly existed since 1948 or 1949, which was in fact an invention of American political scientists in the 1950s and then seeped into American government parlance in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It was not used in the Soviet Union, it was not used in China either. That raises, of course, the question now, what is the intellectual concept the PRC used instead of the Cold War during the Cold War? In 1946, Mao tried to make sense of the world, which, by the way, he barely knew, by arguing that there is a Soviet-American contest over much of the rest of the world, i.e. a struggle between communism and capitalism over what he termed the intermediate zone, in which China was the most important prize. This, of course, is a self-serving argument, making China important to the world and the Chinese Communist Party important in the process. In this world, Mao decided to lean towards one side temporarily to get economic aid for the Chinese modernization project. And since the United States was not willing to provide this aid, he chose the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Soviet Union was only really a second choice. His long-term goal, and the long-term goal of many Chinese nationalists at that time, was to restore China to past greatness and glory and to independence from all other countries. Given the long institutional continuity in the PRC or in the Chinese Communist Party since 1949, this is still one of the long-term goals. It of course digs into 19th century, partially Western ideas of Chinese centrality in world history. For the first 15 years of the PRC, roughly until the mid-1960s, Mao perceived the world as a struggle between evil and doomed capitalist imperialism, headed by the United States, and peace-loving and progressive communism, headed by the Soviet Union. Only once the Sino-Soviet split occurred in the 1960s, Mao needed to reinvent his theory of international relations. Suddenly, the intermediate zone was split into two intermediate zones. One contained Europe, Canada, Australia, and Japan. They all were sources of technology, know-how, and grain for China. And the other one was basically the third world. And once Sino-American rapprochement happened after 1969, Mao again needed to reinvent his theory of the two intermediate zones, and it was transformed into the theory of the three worlds. and this consisted of the two superpowers, the developed world and the underdeveloped world. Technically, this is still the theory that is supposed to guide Chinese foreign policy behavior. As you see in this story, there's no Cold War. Now let me move to my third and last point. Let's think about the post-Cold War period. Can we speak really of a new Cold War between the United States and China? Of course, since there was no Cold War from a Chinese perspective in the first place, this is sort of a rhetorical question. Now, we certainly can now speak of raised tensions short of hot war between the United States and China. Maybe they are not that short of hot war. But however, if all historical periods of events that are just short of hot war are Cold Wars, then the term Cold War really becomes meaningless because you can apply it to so many periods and so many events. However, there are a couple of reasons why the term Cold War is used for describing current Sino-American tensions. First of all, it's a catchy phrase that attracts quickly and cheaply public attention to anybody using it, as we have seen in what Emily said at the very beginning in the exchange between a British and American newspaper in June. Second, the term Cold War or New Cold War also creates a sense of continuity to the pre-1971 Sino-American antagonism. However, my estimate is that this is a false continuity. Now, great powers always have expansive interests, which means they more easily get on each other's turfs than small powers with very limited and maybe local interests. Also, it seems to me that the stakes and the nature of the conflict are quite different. In the 1950s and 1960s, the conflict was about world revolution on the Chinese side and containment of world revolution on the other side. And now it's really about an open and sometimes not so open Chinese pitch for regional, if not hemispheric, or maybe even global domination, versus the management of American strategic, military, economic, and political retreat, or at least retrenchment in the Pacific. So finally, the term Cold War between the US and China also allows the Western public to distinguish easily between good and evil, good, of course, being the supposedly liberal, heterogeneous, and entrepreneurial West, and bad, of course, the authoritarian, dogmatic, chauvinistic, repressive, and centrally run China. Now, personally, I agree with the negative characterization of the current Chinese regime. But today's conflict is one between authoritarianism, which is devoid of much ideology, and Western-style liberalism, which is currently tearing itself apart. So on one final note, I wish that the West could overcome its domestic and multilateral conflicts to regain its collective weight in international politics. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Lorenz, for your comments. And I think one of the points that you highlighted that's really critical to keep in mind is that the concept of the Cold War itself is very much a Euro-American construct that was not necessarily shared by the rest of the world at the time. So up next will be Meredith Oyen, an associate professor at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Professor Oyen has an expertise in US diplomatic history and Sino-American relations. Her book, The Diplomacy of Migration, Transnational Lives, and the Making of US-Chinese Relations in the Cold War, was published by Cornell University Press in 2015. And she's also published a variety of articles in journals including Diplomatic History and the Journal of Cold War Studies. So I will turn it over to you, Meredith.
All right, success, I hope. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Emily, and I'm delighted to be here and to join the panel and to hear what everyone has to say. I feel like this is a topic that I get asked about once a year since roughly Trump's second term. And so it's clearly on the minds of a lot of people, is this another Cold War? I want to start by saying that there's really two ways of making this analogy. One is to compare the current US-China relationship to that of the US and the Soviet Union in the 1940s to early 1990s. And the second way is to compare the relationship to the US-China relationship in the 1940s through 1970s. So we're either comparing it to the Soviet Cold War or the Cold War with China. I think Lorenz has already explained some of the reasons why the terminology is flawed for either, but I wanted to just give some of my thoughts on this. One thing that is wrong with this is that the Soviet-American Cold War analogy, current geopolitics make it obvious that there's a cooling of relations and increase of tensions, but right now we lack some of these really core characteristics of the Sino-American Cold War, right? We lack the persistent threat of total war. We lack this sort of period and atmosphere of bipolarity. It lacks the commitment on the other side, on either side, to contain expansion at all costs. As far as the comparison to the Sino-American Cold War, and I'm not completely convinced that there wasn't a Cold War between the US and China, we could debate that. But the comparison there doesn't really seem to hold either. Some of the characteristics for this Sino-American Cold War between the 40s and 70s is things like direct military conflict or the threat of direct military conflict, contention over support for Taiwan, propaganda wars waged in Asia and beyond, the economic embargo that's led by the United States against China, and the sense of Chinese isolation on the world stage, which takes a lot of different forms during the 1950s and 60s especially. Between the US and China, it's a period of incredible isolation and suspicion, right? This is a period in which there's no sanctioned travel between the two countries. So US passports are banned for travel in China. Chinese travelers face strict controls on exits and access to visas. Student exchanges overall are limited. There's no formal student exchanges, but a handful of students make their way in either direction. Students and scholars who work in STEM fields, Chinese students and scholars who work in STEM fields, come to the United States and find themselves barred from returning home in the atmosphere of the Korean War, when American officials worried that they would go home and aid in the development of China's technology. Journalists find themselves with limited access to each other's countries, with few receiving visas, except under very specific circumstances starting around the time of rapprochement. State-to-state contact was relegated to occasional conferences like Geneva, and the ambassadorial talks that started and stopped repeatedly from 1955 all the way to the Nixon visit. So those are the sort of very limited ways in which they work together. There's also a period in which there is actually pretty extensive backlash against Chinese Americans who were seen as leftists or thought to be too sympathetic to the communist regime. So some issues from that Cold War are obviously still outstanding. We still have a lot of questions about Taiwan and US support for the government there. We certainly debate sometimes about the isolation, about other questions about military contention, especially in the South China Sea. But the isolation factor, the isolation of the PRC on the world stage, the isolation between the people of the US and China is not a reality anymore. So it's not just that China is economically engaged globally or integrated into UN activities, or the fact that it's actively participating in international organizations and meetings, because all of those things are true. It's that the United States and China are so economically intertwined at this point that decoupling will take decades to achieve. So neither the former US-Soviet relationship during the Cold War or the US-China relationship during the Cold War really bears a strong resemblance to what we're seeing right now in terms of the breakdown of US-Chinese relations. All of that said, I do think there is an area in which the comparison, the whole "are we in a new Cold War" question, is especially relevant. And I think that is with respect to the threat of increasing isolation and limited contact, especially people-to-people contact between the United States and China. We're seeing right now an increasing curtailment of exchanges of people, of limiting migration and visas, of limiting movement between countries, even before the pandemic started and sort of drew those activities to a more resounding halt. So it's not as extreme now as it was in the 1950s and the 1960s, but there's definitely trends in the growing tensions before the pandemic that raise concerns about the nature of those contacts, and they're now exacerbated by a situation in which travel has been virtually cut off by the public health crisis. So some of the things we've seen recently that sort of start to make us question this and think about connections to the original Cold War era are things like the closing down of Confucius institutes and the targeting of them as covert arms of the Chinese government or something that was seeking to shape American attitudes. These are very Cold War-esque style propaganda. Limitations on visas for journalists, including retaliatory limits in a very tit-for-tat contest. Calls to limit student visas, which started years back by targeting H-1B visas, which started focusing on China and India especially, but now with increasing questions about Chinese STEM scholars, students and scholars being at the forefront of potentially questions about technological and industrial espionage. So you've seen calls to limit visas, canceling visas of 1,000 Chinese students for background in the People's Liberation Army, or calls to limit visas for members of the Chinese Communist Party. Steps being taken to end the US Fulbright program in China, ending Peace Corps activities in China. So you're seeing this sort of cultural decoupling that's happening in the area of migration and exchanges, and that is sort of reminiscent of the Cold War and begs some of these questions about whether there's significant comparisons that can be made. Of course, right now we're in this period of total cutoff of non-official travel between China and the United States. The US actually recently lowered its travel alert to China to level 3, but China is still not issuing any visas for Americans on the grounds that coronavirus here is still not under control. And then finally, I just want to add that some of the 1950s Cold War era targeting of Chinese Americans for suspected ties to China or suspected sympathies to China, we're seeing those kind of come back around again. And some of that is happening in the context of the coronavirus and racist attacks that are emerging there. But it's also happening through some of the backlash against potential for spies, these questions about dual loyalties and Chinese Americans, naturalized Chinese Americans having dual loyalties. And so those are things that sort of raise those issues all over again. So although I don't really believe that we are in another Cold War, and I question the utility of the analogy in a lot of ways, I think that in this one area, that of people-to-people exchanges and the ways in which we interact, I think there's some echoes of early Cold War history that we should really be attentive to. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for that. And I have to say that I think particularly as we are gearing up to start the new academic year, your comments about limiting visas for international Chinese students is definitely something that's been on a lot of people's minds these days. So last but not least is Taomo Zhou, who is an assistant professor at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and we're very grateful that she got up quite early today to join us for this webinar. Professor Zhou's first book, Migration in a Time of Revolution, China, Indonesia, and the Cold War, was just published last year by Cornell University Press, and her writings have also appeared in journals such as the China Quarterly and Critical Asian Studies. So I will let you take it away, Taomo.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me. It's such a great pleasure to be on this panel with Lorenz and Meredith, two authors I greatly admire. Okay, so I did a poll with my students in an International Cold War History seminar, and this is what they think. So to my surprise, the majority of them actually think we're still stuck in the old Cold War. So why is that so? Here I'm quoting the observation from my colleague An Guan, the author of the most recent Southeast Asia Cold War and Southeast Asia after the Cold War. So basically you see from the region in Southeast Asia that this integration of the Soviet bloc is somehow less relevant. And what is more important is actually the Sino-US rapprochement and reorientation of the People's Republic of China's economic policies and foreign affairs in the late 1970s. So for Southeast Asia, it's very important to position carefully, right? Balancing between the United States and China. this has been a constant reality since the late 1970s. So they basically, Southeast Asia need the United States to counterbalance China, but at the same time, they don't want to be dragged into an unnecessary conflict between the two superpowers. So I think my students' perception speaks to this recent blog piece by Kovo Miskins on the Wilson Center Sources and Method blog, which he argues that there was never a Cold War China because, as Lorenz and Meredith mentioned, Cold War was not part of the everyday public discourse in Mao's China, and China never viewed the conflict between capitalism and socialism as cold, right? I think this observation echo with, for example, Hongye Kun, who argues that the human experiences during the so-called Cold War are so radically different. So we cannot force everything into a coherent whole. And also my colleague here in Singapore, Hajimu Masuda, also argues that, you know, Cold War is not like a weather condition. It's not objective. So it very much rely upon subjective social acceptance, right? And his book actually looks at this transformation of Cold War as a disputable temporary condition to kind of irrefutable actuality during the Korean War. So echoing Lorenz, I think it's true that, you know, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Cold War was a very violent reality. And how do we reconcile that with the perception of Cold War as a long peace? In other words, Cold War seems to be a term that doesn't belong to the global South. However, here I'm going to use Kovo's own excellent book to argue against his own blog piece, in the sense that, you know, we do recognize Cold War is very diverse, but it doesn't mean that we have to deny the very existence of the global phenomenon of bipolarity. So Kovo's book actually shows that even though the exact word of Cold War was not part of the everyday lingua franca, but the mobilization of everyday life continued, right? So for all the third fronters in his book, basically all the workers or militias who were mobilized to migrate to the inland China for infrastructure construction, they probably never traveled outside of China and really understand the larger geopolitics. However, the central leadership's perception of external threat from the Soviet Union and the United States literally determine the trajectory of their personal lives and shape their mentality, their work ethics, and how they found meaning in their lives. So looking beyond high politics, I think Meredith's book, my book, also demonstrate that it's not just the People's Republic. China was a very important player in the Cold War as a sovereign state, but the Chinese migrant communities, who are oftentimes peripheral to nation-state-based bodies of language, are also at the center of a global battle for hearts and mind between two contenders for regime legitimacy and representation of genuine Chinese culture in the world, which are the Chinese Communist government in Beijing and the nationalist government in Taipei. So the two China's contestation over the loyalty of the Chinese diaspora play out wherever there is a significant concentration of overseas Chinese. So all these books show here actually argues that you know, this Beijing versus Taipei struggle was a prominent feature of the Chinese society in Malaya, in Mexico, in the United States. Also a shout out to my colleague Chen Wen-kun, whose book on the Chinese in Philippines during the Cold War is coming out soon. So I think all this work challenges singular understanding of the Cold War as an East versus West conflict, right? So this struggle kind of correlate with the Cold War division, but not exactly. It's more about a sense of political belonging, cultural identity. So Cold War has different diverse manifestations in different regions, not only in China as a nation state, but also in liminal places between a nation state, such as in migrant communities. So here I'd like to argue that not only was Beijing a major player of the Cold War. Not only was a variation of Cold War play out among global Chinese diaspora communities, but China actually hosts one of the few Cold War study centers in the East China Normal University in Shanghai. In China's case, I think framing the study of PRC foreign policy as part of this Cold War international history kind of make the relevant research less sensitive. I guess in the eyes of the gatekeepers of Chinese censorship, this narrative normalized the Chinese experience and opened up to international exchange with global academic communities. So Cold War scholars such as Shen Zhihua, the pioneer of the field shown here, enjoy a kind of unique degree of freedom from censorship in the early 2000s. And the internationalization of the Cold War studies in China is also closely connected to the opening of the PRC Foreign Ministry archives in Beijing in the early 2000s. So their document collection review what is really inside the black box of PRC foreign policy making mechanism. So these materials form the backbone of my own book, of course, but also a series of excellent works that really delineate the inner work of PRC foreign policy. For our audience who are interested in the microcosmos of how the archive work, I recommend you to read Salman Khan in his Muslim Trader Norman Spy. In his acknowledgement, he actually vividly captured how the archivist will share watermelons with the researcher in the summer and will scold him for not wearing enough clothes in the winter. So recently, Professor Shen Zhihua published this piece kind of reflecting on his extraordinary personal journey from a Redux rebel to a political prisoner and later to a successful business person, and now a world-renowned Cold War historian, but without a college degree. And in which he said very painfully that in China it's often painful and even dangerous to be a scholar. So very sadly, last year, the research center at East China Normal University was closed down for internal inspection. And the Foreign Ministry Archive has been closed since 2012, and we probably will never be able to see the documents inside in the near future. So here I probably end with a kind of sad conclusion that it's a Cold War 2.0 when it's impossible to study Cold War 1.0 in China. I think Emily and Dennis Ho from Yale organized earlier sessions on how to study PRC history in a new era, and we can continue the discussion later on. Okay, that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Taomo. I think one thing that all of our panelists have agreed on and that you highlighted very nicely is that the Cold War has definitely meant different things to different people, and that it continues to be experienced in a variety of ways, particularly as you showed for your students in Singapore right now. So I'd like to bring all of our panelists back on screen for the Q&A. So if you can just start your videos again so we can bring you back onto the screen. So just to get things started, I wanted to ask a follow-up question based on all of your remarks. So each of you suggested in your talks that the Cold War was a very long-lasting, complex phenomenon, and that perhaps it doesn't really shed light on what's going on between the United States and China today. So I'm curious, since all of you are historians, is there maybe a more useful historical analogy that you would use than the Cold War to describe what's actually going on between the United States and China? Or perhaps if I could even push this question a little bit further, is it useful at all to use historical analogies to understand contemporary politics and contemporary situations? So it's kind of a broad question, but I'll let you take that in whatever direction you like, and I will let you decide whichever order you would like to speak in.
I can start first. I think Cold War is a very long process. So one question is the chronology, right? So are we going to use this more than 4 decades of tension between Washington and Moscow to describe, you know, what emerged just in the past 2 years, the escalation of tension between Beijing and Washington. So I think from my perspective, maybe the current moment look very similar to 1965 in the sense that it's like a inflection point. In the global South, you see like kind of the collapse of the Bandung generation of leadership in Asia and Africa. And in the United States, of course, we see the mass deployment of US forces in Vietnam. And I guess more similarly is the outbreak of social protests and a struggle for racial justice in the United States. In a sense, I think we inherited that world, you know, that was given birth, that was basically emerged out of the chaos in 1965. And in our current moment, I think it's not really a new Cold War, but probably it's a crisis of capitalism that both China and the United States are facing. So both countries are facing kind of increasing global inequality and struggling to provide better safety, social safety net and welfare to the working class. Whereas the trade between the two countries actually gave rise to a successful professional elites and business elites. So here, I guess I'm following the line of logic in Adam Tooze's London Review of Books article, Whose Century? And particularly the argument put forward by Matthew Kling and Michael Peters in Trade Wars are class wars. But yeah, I'm open to other suggestions or opinions.
Well, maybe then I can jump in. You know, we all seem to agree that the Cold War as an intellectual concept might not work because for various reasons. We explained that. We could, however, sort of fall back and say the Cold War is an ideological conflict between what I would call, you know, a leftist radical challenge to the existing imperialist system, a dying system in the first half of the 20th century, and maybe, you know, the liberal capitalist reformist, actually, you know, a challenge. And then, you know, to a certain degree, China comes then in because China did actually experience the first hot war of the Cold War, and that's of course the Chinese Civil War as it starts in the late 1920s. And we still have a leftover with the Taiwan issue today, but a lot of that is basically devoid of ideology now. This is about basically now trying to play, you know, the nationalist card. Who is representing the real China, right? I mean, nobody really in the Chinese Communist Party really believes in a kind of Maoist ideology, which Mao apparently believed in the late 1950s. Even if Xi Jinping tries to window dress now as a great actually communist thinker, I mean, he isn't. This is window dressing. Now, to go back to one of the questions is analogies, are they useful? I mean, what's the use of an analogy? Why do we use analogies? The analogies are, we use an analogy to use the familiar to explain the unfamiliar, right? So it's an instrument to actually explain something we don't know yet. But if the analogy becomes actually just the nature of the thing we want to explain, you know, then we have a problem. So we always have to be clear that no historical context is the same. We are in a completely different world now than we were in the 50s and 60s. You know, an analogy we could think about is, you know, the PRC in 2020 looks to us like Japan looked in 1985, as, you know, this to a certain degree constructed challenge, threat, at the cusp of actually taking over the world. And what we completely disregard at the moment are the enormous internal problems China faces now. Taomo Zhou has talked about this a little bit, you know, the crisis of capitalism in China too. We didn't see this in Japan, that Japan faced enormous crisis in the 80s that was sort of, we couldn't see from the outside that clearly. So I see this as an analogy that, you know, China will face major problems, and one is a generational problem of leadership, and the other one is a legitimacy crisis, and so on. And then finally, what is also different is, I think we have for the first time, as Taomo said, there's the crisis of capitalism in the West. We have a true, actually, sort of legitimacy crisis in the West. We have the weakness of the West tearing itself apart over, I mean, minor things. I think, you know, there is sort of no sense of purpose in the West. What do we stand for as liberal capitalist states, as a group of liberal capitalist states that are allied? And this seems to me, you know, also an opening for a rising China that it can exploit at the moment.
My only thing to add to that, I think, is that, you know, historical analogies are phenomenally tempting, especially now, because they make phenomenal memes, right? They make great headlines, they make great cartoons, they're easy to understand, they're easy to sort of pick up and run with. And the problem is that there's a temptation, like as sort of a broad strokes, here's a way to think about this. I think they can be really useful, right? We say, but just by asking the question, are we in a new Cold War with China? It forces us to start thinking through, okay, where are we at with China? What's going on? What are the key factors? What do we need to be thinking about? As soon as you start digging deep and you start like making Hong Kong into a modern Berlin, you get too far down a rabbit hole and it stops being useful. So I think historical analogies are great for that sort of broad strokes opening the question, and then inevitably, especially if you're in a room full of academics, somebody takes it too far and then they stop being useful.
So we've gotten a bunch of questions, and I'll try to address as many of them as possible. A couple of them kind of overlap. So in response to my question about whether or not there's a more accurate historical analogy that you might use to understand this time period, some people in the audience have proposed potentially different analogies. So someone asked, might this pending conflict be more akin to UK-German relations prior to the First World War? My colleague at UCI, Jeff Wasserstrom, has also proposed the idea that maybe this period might be more akin to the Sino-Soviet split. He writes that too was a period that saw two countries that had become increasingly intertwined, becoming increasingly at odds. So could one say that perhaps the US and China now represent different versions of capitalism? So how would you maybe respond to those types of analogies about either the Sino-Soviet split or British-German relations prior to World War I? Are either of those kind of accessible or applicable, do you think, to the contemporary situation?
Well, maybe I just talk pre-World War I, you know, the German-British antagonism. This was about a small challenger trying actually to challenge the dominant power in the world. It was not necessarily an economic race, it was actually a naval arms race in which Germany ultimately realized it was going to lose, and that was to a certain degree the reason why there's World War I. I don't see really that the naval arms race or the military arms race between China and the United States are that central actually to the conflict. I mean, there is this component, there's definitely a Chinese attempt to beef up capabilities, but it's not the Germany of the pre-World War I period. I think that the challenge is a very different one. It's also, China is much bigger in terms of an economy and its population, so it just doesn't work. I think there are too many differences. So I would actually throw this out for as an example, as an analogy.
I think Lorenz is the foremost expert on Sino-Soviet split. So I try to answer first, like the question whether this is a Sino-Soviet split within the capitalist camp, in the sense that these are two versions of capitalism. I think it did bear some similarities, but on the other hand, I feel like during, so I was greatly inspired by Julia Lovo's recent book, Maoism, A Global History. She really delineated the process, how Mao's China was a global actor. But overwhelmingly, I think during Mao's era, the propaganda, the PRC's global PR campaign was more glorious, play a more important role than the substantial economic and military support China offered to foreign, whether it's communist insurgencies or other like pro-China communist forces. So in other words, now we kind of see a reversal. It's like China was eager to export infrastructure, either to engage in trade. But as Lorenz mentioned earlier, there was a devoid of ideology. Like Xi Jinping thought, I don't know how powerful that is as a form of soft power. Confucius Institute also with kind of ambiguous and ambivalent result. So it did bear similarity, but not exactly the same. I think China now is more, the role of ideology has significantly decreased.
I really like the Sino-Soviet split idea, but the first thing I did is try and take the analogy one step further, in which case, you know, that's happening in a context in which there's opposition to the United States. So you need that other power out there somewhere, and that is hard to identify in the current situation. So I think, you know, the other problem with some of those, I mean, the reason why the Cold War is so beloved as the historical analogy du jour is that everyone recognizes that, even if they don't really know what it is. You know, whereas not everyone has like a perfect grasp on German, you know, UK relations before World War I. But at least, like, well, Cold War, I think I know what that is. That makes sense. I can hold on to that and use it. But I definitely want to go reading on the Sino-Soviet split analogy, because I like that one.
Jeff wanted me to point out that he was not the one who came up with that analogy. It was Julian Goertz, who is also a China specialist. So a couple of questions are kind of asking you to step into the shoes of maybe policy experts or IR experts. So someone is asking, you know, as historians, what brought about the end of the first Cold War, if the first Cold War did indeed have an end? And can we apply these same reasons to what might bring about an end to the current state of Sino-US tensions that we are currently occupying? And someone else asked maybe a kind of variant of this question, where they were curious, if you were advising the White House today, what sort of policy prescriptions would you advise to help minimize or bring down the tensions between the United States and China?
Well, maybe I should start, because I have thought about, you know, what brought about the end of the first Cold War for 15 years and sort of wrote a book about it. And of course, the analysis is one on different levels. And one is the sheer exhaustion of the Soviet Union. It is not I see the Sino-American conflict not as a boxing competition, but as a long distance race, you know, even marathon, maybe, you know, whatever you can come up with an analogy here. And the Soviet Union simply, you know, gave up because it couldn't compete anymore. And then there's a variety of reasons why this is the case. You know, the wrong investments long term into all kinds of enterprises across the Soviet periphery or the socialist periphery. There's structural change in the world that really made the Soviet Union into a dinosaur, and that couldn't survive anymore in a new ecosystem. So when you think about the end of the Cold War in these terms, as, you know, one of these powers simply is devoid of ideology. Ideology doesn't make sense anymore. It has lost its economic capability. That's very clear to the Soviet leaders, probably by the 60s already. And then you look at structural change, that the ecosystem sort of is disappearing where this power can thrive. And that the Soviet Union also does not recognize actually larger structural changes that then prevents the Soviet Union from adapting. Well, then, you know, the advice I would give to President Trump or any future president is, well, first of all, you know, think about, you know, what you can do to make actually the United States fit to compete if you want to continue to compete. And that requires a very, very deep analysis. The next thing is, how do you treat your allies? You have a lot of natural allies who flock to you. You know, do you see them as competitors, or do you see them as allies? And do you want to invest into them, and do you want to allow them to invest in you? So there must be a more radical rethink of how do we stay at the top of the game. I mean, I'm not somebody who likes this idea of the rise and the fall of great powers, although that particular author was on my committee. But you know, we might want to think in these terms. What are the mistakes the Soviet Union committed, and how can we avoid these mistakes in the West?
If I can tack onto that, because I agree with your assessment, but my other piece of advice to President Trump for you know, bettering U.S.-Chinese relations going forward is that instead of this cultural decoupling where we pull further and further apart, we need to in fact be doubling down on having Chinese students here and especially sending Americans to China. Right, there's something like 360, I think, thousand Chinese students in the U.S. the last time I saw, and then the last figures I saw for U.S. students in China was around 11,000. And the more we send, the more we have people who have experience in each other's countries, the more you have people who have, you know, sort of a soft spot for that country, and that can sort of develop into something. And that, I mean, it's a very basic thing, but it's actually really important, and it's easy to lose sight of the importance of cultural ties and person-to-person ties and just movement between the two countries in the midst of all of the other like economic and political and great power geopolitical things. But that's really foundational to a relationship, and that is the thing that is unraveling, I think, fastest right now.
I totally agree with Lorenz and Meredith, especially Meredith's point that the people-to-people contact is crucial. And I think it's Matt Evangelista's book on armed forces, in which he argues that the Cold War actually was brought down by the transnational intellectual movement by nuclear scientists from both Soviet Union and the United States. So the international, transnational intellectual community or civil community, civil society that play a very important role. And also I think another additional question is where China is heading, right? We're nearing the US election, of course, that's on everyone's mind, but I think whether China is going to continue reform and opening. So we already see Xi taking a step back in the rules don't set out to set a term limit on the leadership. So I think that's a huge question mark, whether China is going to take another turn going back. It's impossible technically to go back to the Mao era, but whether Xi wants to take a different path from the path that is set out by Deng in the late 1970s.
So Taomo, you have a question directed to you, so I'll just read this. But this audience member was interested in the perspectives of Southeast Asians in terms of both Cold War 1.0 and Cold War 2.0. And they ask, you know, in the earlier Cold War, the dominant players that Southeast Asia had to deal with were Soviet Union, the United States, and China, while currently the big powers seem to be more of a clear duality between China and the United States. So is that actually the sense that you get among Southeast Asians? Have their experiences or political discourses changed regarding China-US relations? So there, I guess this person is more interested in what the view from Southeast Asia looks like today.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's, generally speaking, I think, of course, the Soviet Union was very influential in the countries that allied with the communist camp, such as, for example, Vietnam, right? But overwhelmingly, as I stated in my presentation, since the 1970s, up until today, the South China Sea crisis or tension, the overall geopolitical structure look very similar. It's more about China and the United States because China is so close. It's such a powerful neighbor that Southeast Asian countries need to deal very delicately. And another thing, I think it's probably because of the presence of large Chinese diaspora communities all across Southeast Asia. So that's another very delicate, complicated, and contentious issue, especially in the early years of the Cold War, right? So where to which country would these people pledge loyalty, and especially the Chinese who are viewed as being predominantly capitalist and now are devoted to a communist China. So I guess during I would say until the 1960s, that's pretty much the key issue. And from the US perspective, well, the trope is the ethnic Chinese were the fifth column of the People's Republic of China, which kind of echo with what Meredith says about now the Chinese communities in the United States. So I think some larger themes, of course, the issues are different in Southeast Asia, but some of the larger themes, the analytical framework we can use in seeing Southeast Asia and seeing now the 21st century China and US are kind of similar and echo with one another.
So we have a ton more questions left. I won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to tackle just a few more in our remaining time. So this person is curious, from your perspective as historians, how comfortable are you with the notion that the current state of US-China relations, however we want to label it, is driven by the particular choices of individual leaders versus the product of deeper structural factors? So if Joe Biden becomes president in the fall, will that fundamentally change the relationship between the United States and China, or are these tensions just a product of deeper structural problems that are going on between the two countries?
I mean, I can start on that one. I feel like it is so tempting so often to just to say, oh, well, you know, if President Trump was only X, Y, or Z. And yet you see this actually, there was a recent New York Times Cold War article, sort of, it's, you know, is this the new Cold War kind of thing? And on its delineated list of reasons why we're in a new Cold War with China, every sentence started with President Trump. And it was something that he had just done that just caused this. Except that, you know, underneath a lot of these issues, there's actually a lot of fair points and relevant problems that have been existing for a long time, right? So you know, behind all of the economic trade wars and everything else and all the complaints about how the trade war has been handled, there were some very real complaints about trade imbalances and the nature of trade and the nature of intellectual property protection and how those things have operated for a very long time between the US and China. Underneath all of the backlash against Chinese students in the United States are some very real concerns about the ways that some individuals have used information in the United States and brought it back and forth, and some questions about, you know, what constitutes spying, what constitutes technology theft, and not just, you know, fair use by a student. So there's real issues underneath all of this, and so you can, there are clear ways in which our current administration has not helped matters and has chosen, especially this year, in the context of the pandemic, when it becomes very important to really highlight who's to blame, right? And that became very, very especially important. And there's certainly ways in which actions by Xi Jinping have furthered and perpetuated, but we have differences. We have some really core differences in how we see the world and how we operate in these really fundamental areas. And those were existing. They you know, we certainly see issues in the South China Sea differently and have for a very long time. And so I don't think any of these issues have sprung up overnight. I have been surprised by the speed with which the Cold War rhetoric in the press has sprung up overnight and then persisted for 3 years. But it's certainly not the case that there's, you know, everything was hunky-dory 4 years ago and now suddenly we have issues.
Let me chime in here too. I would agree with that analysis. I mean, there is probably a change in style and tone, but many of the problems that China and the United States are facing now are problems that have already existed 10 or 15 years ago. I want to sort of remind everybody that the other candidate in 2016 wasn't very pro-Chinese either. You just have to read her actually program from 2016. Hillary Clinton also used anti-Chinese rhetoric, and she was also willing to get tough on the Chinese. So there's definitely a change from previous administrations, 2016 in tone and style. In substance, I'm not quite convinced that President Trump, really, follows through with substance. There's a lot of rhetoric and a lot of propaganda. But, I completely agree there are issues that, have to be addressed. And that is one, the United States is a relatively open economic system. You can't really say that about China. When China now complains about TikTok, that this is, transfer of Chinese technological knowledge to the United States, since 1949, China has used technology transfers to modernize. That was exactly why China actually chose the Soviet Union, to transfer technology from the Soviet Union. And once that lemon was actually squeezed out, it turned in the 60s actually to Japan and to Germany and to the UK. Japan just played the game a little bit more cautiously and didn't transfer all of the technology and tries to keep to that technology. So these are old, actually, old themes that really go back now into even the so-called Sino-American Cold War of pre-71. So I see the really large-scale continuities, and one president might change a little bit the tone and the style, but it takes more to change this relationship substantially.
So I just follow up here. I really like what Lorenz and Meredith said, and indeed, there is deeper structural problem. And from the China side, I think it's true that recently we see the very Twitter active spokesperson, I think spokesperson Zhou Lijian of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. So it sounds like lots of observers think, China has done biding its time, is adopting this wolf diplomacy strategy, being more progressive. It's true there is a kind of a parallel shift on the China side as well. And in other words, China is seeing kind of US as an obstacle to its goals of preserving its, position in regional dominance. But I don't think, unlike the Cold War, I don't think China believes it has to get rid of the whole system to defeat the US, to achieve its goal. And I think Neil Ferguson, in one of his recent pieces, he kind of compared the situation, probably to a certain degree of exaggeration, as China and US entering a dark forest. It's like a scene in China sci-fi writer Liu Cixin's trilogy. So basically China is building the whole international system as a Darwinist. I don't necessarily believe that's the case. And here, if I could deviate, I want to address one question raised by Shelley Chen in the Q&A. So Professor Shelley Chen from UC Santa Barbara. I was actually going to cite Shelley because Shelley wrote this really interesting piece on the Journal of Asia Studies for the case of diaspora. So diaspora is a very contentious term, and not all scholars of Chinese overseas accept that term. And I think it sounds like we have a similar situation with the Cold War, right? So Cold War, it seems like Cold War didn't really end in part. The first Cold War didn't really end in part of the globe, like certainly not on the Korean Peninsula. And you can argue to some extent, I think we all agree that in some regions, the contemporary conflict is a continuation of the first Cold War. So I think despite our disagreement on the term of the Cold War, it still served as a very useful umbrella concept for studying global comparisons and for building global interconnectivities.
So I think I'll ask just one more question. We've gotten a bunch of questions pertaining to the theme of economic interdependence between China and the United States. This is something that Meredith touched on in her presentation. But would you agree that because of the increased economic interdependence between China and the United States today, that this is really preventing full-scale hostilities? And if that is the case, can we still expect to see kind of a more limited confrontation, such as between technological leaders? I mean, Lorenz had also kind of mentioned TikTok briefly. So what do you think about this economic interdependence angle between China and the US?
Well, let me just start. Does it prevent hostilities? The question is, does any of the two sides actually want hostilities in the first place? There might be some skirmishes here and there. I mean, I could imagine that there's going to be skirmishes in the South China Sea, but I can't see a kind of a Sino-American conflict where now the United States tries to build up bases around China and have an active containment policy. So again, you know, I fear the analogy doesn't work. But which side is willing actually to sacrifice more? And I think here probably my sense is that the Chinese leadership is willing actually to sacrifice some part of economic growth and playing the nationalist card at home, that this is for the greater nation of China, or any propaganda you can come up with. I'm less convinced that the United States is willing to make these sacrifices, and that's also a result of the internal divisions, that there's not enough popular backing. So I think here, you know, probably China has the longer breath.
I'll just say briefly about the technology aspects. I think it's true, like, I recently, probably because I'm from Shenzhen, so that's the city known as the city for fakes, for Shanzhai, or in Chinese called like the fortress, I guess, the mountain fortress, which means like copying, tinkering, violating intellectual copyright. I recently read a really interesting book by Eugenia Ling, Vernacular Capitalism, in which she shows really interesting, this is nothing new, right? This happened like in early 20th century. So when China started to engage with global capitalism, or enter the global stage, there's this conflict between the Chinese model of, or what do you call it, innovation, and the Western corporate laboratory-led intellectual property regime. So the clash of the two, as she showed, is not just China versus the West, but again, going back to capitalism, this is capitalism's kind of window dressing to use exclusive international intellectual copyright to show that there is a frictionless international exchange. But to answer that question, I think technology is a very interesting realm to see Sino-US relations. It builds bonds, but it's also it's a field that generates lots of conflicts.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I would say you see that too with now the sort of secondary push against WeChat and American technological companies using WeChat. And so you see this, it's like happening on multiple levels where there's on the one hand, so much economic interdependence, so much resentment over the interdependence at times. And then by cutting off some of these ways that we actually have exchanges and contacts through these companies, then you have, you know, sort of potential for further tensions. So it becomes very intertwined with the economic decoupling, and the attempts at technological decoupling become intertwined with decoupling the people, and all of that leads to increased tension.
Great. Well, we are just about out of time. Again, I want to thank our three wonderful panelists, Lorenz, Meredith, and Taomo, and also for all of you for sticking around to the end. Be on the lookout tomorrow for a follow-up email where I'll include links to some of the writings that our panelists have mentioned throughout this webinar. And if you liked this event and want to learn more, please do subscribe to our mailing list. I'm just putting that in the chat. Click on the link and then scroll down to the bottom of the page and you can subscribe to our mailing list. So have a wonderful evening or a wonderful morning, depending on where you're watching this, and please do take care.